Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. What a difference 2 years makes. In September 2003, the city was still reeling from 9/11. The economy was in the tank. 30 consecutive months of decline. Hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, a $6.7 billion deficit. Michael Bloomberg's approval rating was also in the toilet. He was hugely unpopular, getting the lowest approval ratings of any mayor, having just pushed through the largest property tax increase in New York City history. Today, the story is far different. The economy has grown for 7 straight quarters after 11 quarters of decline. The city experienced a $3.5 billion surplus this year. Jobs are up to the highest levels on record. So are Bloomberg's poll numbers. To talk about the New York City economy, its problems and prospects, and politics, Freddie, Bloomy, Hillary, Elliot, George, and Billy is William C. Thompson, the Comptroller of the City of New York. Welcome back, Bill.
Hi, Doug. How are you?
Good. It's been 2 years. It's been too long. Let's get right into it.
Okay.
Let's start with the economy before we get into politics. How did the city make it back? I've got your testimony here, July 28, 2005, Financial Control Board meeting. What happened?
I think a number of things. I think that first, New York City didn't repeat, as we had our major budget crisis, we didn't repeat the mistakes of the mid-1970s. When you slashed city services to the bone, when you destroyed quality of life, and you made New York City an unsafe and unlivable city. I think that the individuals involved, and in this case the mayor, the city council, sure, the comptroller's office and others, all had urged a balanced approach. And I think that's what occurred. So it put New York City in a better place to be able to rebound.
Okay.
Then, if you look at the economy right now, it is being fueled by tourism, which is way up these days. I mean, literally the average vacancy rate or the average occupancy rate is right about 90%, which is one of the highest in the city's history.
In the streets.
It's amazing.
You can see it, you can hear it.
Number 2, the real estate boom. Real estate prices continue to go up. The assessments continue to go up. There's a lot of that is driving.
Taxes on homeowners continue to go up.
Taxes, but it's not just the taxes on homeowners which have gone up.
It's the value,
it's
right.
the assessments also which have gone up. All of that has fueled a major economic boom, as well as, I think most sectors in the city right now, Wall Street's doing well. They're not booming, but they're doing well. So all of that combined has put New York City and New York City government in a place where, no, we're looking at, you know, we ended the last fiscal year with a surplus, probably the biggest surplus we've ever had in history.
Okay, we're going to talk about the surplus in a minute. The mayor did a good job then.
The mayor, in a number of ways, has done a good job, and I've never been one who said that he hasn't. I've given him credit in areas that I think he's done well, and the budget is one of those areas.
Okay. Talk about challenges. In your July audit, you point out some real risks in the budget picture. Overall, dynamite, but big question marks.
We've got out-year budget gaps. That, I mean, the way that this year, the budget year, we're on a July 1st to June 30th budget year.
And this is the 2006 fiscal year budget we're in now.
The way that we closed the budget gap was by that surplus. The next year, we're looking at a budget gap that's about $3.5 billion. Our out-year budget gaps all continue to be in excess of $3 billion. That's something we have to worry about.
Now, did the mayor make a mistake putting all of that surplus into closing this budget gap rather than reducing the long-term imbalance between expenses and revenues?
Well, there's some things that you can do. As far as creating or getting rid of that that out-year gaps, the imbalance in the budget, some of it could be used to that, but there's a lot more that has to be done to be able to do that. We're still being fueled and increase in our budget fueled by Medicaid costs, which continue to go up, debt service and pension payments. Those are the three areas that continue to go.
And those three areas are eating up a huge proportion of the budget.
It is, even though I think you'll start to see over the next few years, if the market continues at least to be decent, not great, but decent, you'll see our expenses on pension costs start to come down, because all of that is a process of averaging over a period of time.
Okay.
That will start to, but we really have to create focus on Medicaid fraud and waste, and start to create a real workable system that serves people, that provides quality health care for them, at the same point doesn't break the city's budget.
Are you optimistic about this? I mean, this has got to come out of the state government in Albany, the legislature and the governor's office, and I don't know about you, but I'm not very sanguine about
this. See, the
this.
difference is because, and particularly when you look at Medicaid costs, it's not just eating up New York City. It's all the counties.
Right.
If you look
Right.
out in Nassau, Tom Swazi's
Right.
talking about it, Suffolk County, Westchester, it is eating up because
Delaware, Otsego, just go upstate.
Because in New York, the municipalities have to make up 25% of it also, as opposed to other places around the country where they don't have to contribute. It eats all of us up. So I think you're going to have to see eventually the state legislature address the issue. So that's a huge problem that has to be dealt with. What I would have liked to have seen with the budget surplus this year, no, some of it moving into the next year to be able to offset some of the budget gap. But at the same point, talked about a rainy day fund. When there is no contingency that we say, okay, look, there's a surplus, let's take some of it, put it away, and don't use it the next year. Maybe we use it when, as we found out, after September 11th, and we faced a massive budget gap of $6.7 billion, well, we could have used some of that to fill that. And that's what I've advocated also over a period of time. As we see surpluses, let's take some of that, put it on the side and say for real emergencies, not just the next year.
Why hasn't this happened?
Some of it is legislative. I think that right now it's not allowed. If what you wind up doing with a surplus, because you really can't roll it into the next year, you prepay bills.
Okay.
So we have bills that are due after July 1st. You prepay them before that. And that's what you
and that would reduce your long-term expenditures anyway.
Yes, no. I mean, as I said, basically you're just kind of prepaying things that you
so
pay.
It doesn't give you a net long-term advantage.
It really doesn't.
Okay.
So what we need to do over a period of time is, as you see surpluses, be able to use some of that for the next year, be able to use some of that to reduce some of your long-term debt, and be able to use some of it to put in a rainy day fund. That makes the most sense for the long-term gains for the city.
Okay. In your audit, you also mentioned two other big things down the road. One is the labor negotiations, teachers' contract. I mean, you note that if it followed the PBA settlement, it'd be $980 million. Under the new PERB guidelines, I don't know if you guys have figured out how much that would cost, but we're talking about more than $500 million here.
Well, it is, the one thing, and no, we don't, the mayor has put a certain amount of money on the side. We don't believe enough to be able to, fill those gaps. But in the end, it's kind of you get what you pay for. If you want to retain teachers, and we're looking at teachers who are leaving in larger and larger numbers, a lot of it because of the atmosphere in the schools, you're going to have to pay people. And, if not, we're going to wind up where we were 4 or 5 years ago, where qualified teachers went to New Jersey and Nassau and Suffolk and Westchester, and New York City had a larger percentage of uncertified teachers. They'd like you to believe these days that, well, look what we've done. We've created 100% of the teachers are now certified. Some of that was the State Department of Education saying you had to. Some of it also was you paid more. And as you continue to do that, you'll attract qualified teachers. As that continues and the gap between New York City and other places widens again, well, you're going to start to see qualified teachers go other places. So it's something you have to do. In the end, we haven't budgeted fully for it. And I think that's something we're going to wind up having to deal with over the next 6 months.
Let's talk about another education funding matter, CFE, $5.6 billion a year. The mayor says, no way we're going to pay any of this. Is it reasonable that the city won't have a liability? And if it does have a liability, that ain't in the budget either.
No, and I think that that's something, even though that continues to drag and to drag and to drag. I mean, the governor has appealed it again. I mean, this is something, if you want to talk about knowing an issue, whether it was my time at the Board of Education as the president, and we kind of were involved deeply in that lawsuit, or as you looked at the three masters, the three-person panel that the judge appointed, my father was one of those three. And the recommendation, no, the one thing that they didn't do was to hold the city harmless. This is going to be up to the legislature, the state legislature, to determine what piece of this New York City is going to have to absorb. No, there is no money there right now for it. At the same point, I think that this will continue to drag a little longer. And the one thing that we all need to do in the next year, as I think it's one thing that everybody could agree on, everybody who's running for governor, I think we all need in New York City to ask the question, would you continue the lawsuit? Would you continue the appeals? And I think the reality is most of them, I know that Elliot Spitzer wouldn't continue continue the lawsuit or continue the appeals. I think we all have to ask those questions.
Okay, so this year we have a $50.2 billion budget. We're looking at, as you said, big out-year gaps. You've looked at the dangers. But you've looked at out-year gaps before. I believe you testified prior to this budget year that we might have a $3.8 billion gap, and in fact, we closed it. Is it possible that our revenues again can so exceed the projections that the out-year gaps in the mayor's 4-year financial plan will actually be much less? And is that part of a political game, if you will, here?
No, I think that the one thing that you look at, there are enough. The one thing about New York City, and particularly after the mid-'70s, there are more people looking at New York City's budget than any other.
Albany's.
Somebody should look at the national budget.
Please.
I mean, it would be nice to see that type of review. In New York City, you've got everybody from my office and the budget, the independent budget office, the Citizens Budget Commission, the Financial Control Board. Everybody looks at New York City's budget. I think we all are agreed. And, the mayor's, we disagree slightly with the mayor's numbers. We think his revenue numbers are a little low, but it's still. I don't know. Eventually, we're not going to keep growing at the level that we're growing. We're going to, hit a little bit of a bump. When that happens, then you're behind the 8 ball again. And that's the one thing eventually we're going to have to deal with in New York City is you can't continue to lurch from good budget years, okay, a slightly bad budget year, another good budget year. In bad budget years, you wind up making cuts. In good budget years, you increase your spending. Eventually, we're going to have to deal with it in a slightly different fashion, I think.
And in fact, we haven't really dealt with this structural imbalance. Clearly, I mean, this was an election year, a $50.2 billion budget, $3.5 billion budget surplus. There were a lot of goodies that were handed out, both by the mayor and the city council this year. And I always get the feeling that we're going to pay for this somewhere down the line. Are we?
Well, I mean, eventually, if revenues start to slide, the one thing that everybody keeps talking about is eventually there's going to be the housing bubble is going to burst.
Because that's fueling it.
If it does, well, then all of a sudden then we're going to wind up in a tougher place. And I think that the one thing, it is a concern for city government. It's also a concern for people. There are lots of people who have most of their life savings in their house.
Excuse me, thank you.
Almost all of us.
Right.
And then what happens is if there is a bust, well, then your house isn't quite as the valuation isn't where it is. The only good thing, and the one thing that we did in our report this year and in our economic notes for the quarter, was to look at places around the country and look at other reports. And the one thing that New York City is, I mean, the good news and the bad news. The good news is, or the good and the kind of almost as good news, we continue to go up. We haven't jumped as much as other places around the country, as places like Miami and San Diego and others. But when you start to compare New York City then with sustainability, if the bubble bursts, how bad will it be? It won't be anywhere near as bad here in New York City as a number of other places around the country. So they think that in looking at some reports and other studies on New York City, we're perhaps just 25% higher than we might be right now, as opposed to other places that are 50, 60, 70% higher. We wouldn't take as bad a hit here. So that's the comforting news if we wound up having the housing bubble burst in New York City.
Okay. Now, the last time we talked was in September 2003. I was shocked that it was that long. I mean, we've talked personally, but not on the show. We were really in the midst of this, as I said in the intro, this post 9/11 decline. We seem to be out of it both fiscally and psychologically. It seems New York is back. And you mentioned the tourism. Do you get that sense?
No, in a lot of ways, New York is back. The one thing that I would, that I'd say to people that we have to be cautious about. We've grown a lot. We've added a number of jobs back, tens of thousands of jobs back into the economy. The unemployment rate continues to dip a bit, which is good for New York City. The one thing we still have when it comes to unemployment, I think if you look at the CSS, their reports.
I want to talk about
and
that.
the concerns that they've expressed. First, 2 years ago, looking at the fact that, half of the black men in New York City between the age of 18 and 64 are unemployed. That's a huge concern. When you look at the number and the growing rate of disconnected, those between 16 and 24 who are out of school, who aren't working, who aren't doing anything, disconnected young people.
Sure.
We have to be concerned about that. So while we, can congratulate ourselves that the city really is, when you look at tourism and you look at the spirit of New Yorkers in a lot of ways, we're back.
The bounce is back.
We're back and probably stronger. The one thing I've said, and this has gone on for the last, even when we weren't doing as well fiscally, New York City and its residents were strong and were unified and have been together for the last, ever since September 11th, probably stronger than ever before. But the one thing that we have to be concerned about is, at times we like to, people like to say things are great. Well, things may be better, but we still have a long way to go.
Okay. Let's move to my favorite part of talking with you, and that's, a review of the audits. I want to start with some of your favorite agencies, and I'll just list them first. I mean, the Department of Education and the MTA. Let's start with the Department of Education. You've been critical of the department on a number of levels, and their contracting, their off-budget spending, their no-bid contracts. Talk about DOE as an agency, fiscally, your concerns.
Well, a few concerns. Number one, and as you pointed out, no-bid contracts, contracts. I mean, the one thing that happened when you went from a Board of Education to a Department of Education and you gave the mayor control, the legislation was changed partially, but not all of it. There's a gray area. So the DOE, now Department of Education, can do almost anything that they want on a budget basis, can do anything that they want almost on a contract basis. That's wrong. I mean, we had pushed legislation and asked to have legislation introduced that would clear that up and treat them like any other city agency. That hasn't passed yet. So they can still do no-bid contracts. They can still do things that you look at them and go, how is that possible at all? And then, last but not least, last budget year, not this one, but the last one, when we talked about, and the chancellor talked about, taking $250 million out of the bureaucracy and directing it into the classroom. At a certain point, and I guess to go back and steal an old phrase, we wound up, after we looked at it, kind of saying, where's the beef? That we could only, of the 250 that he claimed, we could only basically identify about 140 that went back into the classroom. The question was, where was more than $100 million? So, and it was very good. They were able to say, well, the Comptroller's office really doesn't understand it. Of course we do. We understand numbers better than they do. And then the thing that, as I said, well, who would you rather believe in this situation? Because they had just the year before overspent their budget by I think it was 140 or 170 million dollars. Would you rather believe the people who know the numbers, or kind of believe the people who just overspent their budget by over 150 million dollars?
Nice question.
In the end, I think it really comes down to having the Department of Education, and we're working with them on it. I will give the chancellor credit for that. That they sat down and looked at our numbers. They might have disagreed, but we're moving forward with them to create a budget for them that's transparent, that people can look at and understand. One of the great knocks, and I'll be quick on this, that when I was at the Board of Education, one of the things I used to hate before I went there, and I was in city government, they'd come in and say they had budget gaps. No one knew. No one could read their budget. Then you went through a period of time where we probably had the most transparent, when Rudy Crew was there and I was the president of the board, where it was the most transparent budget. You broke everything down to a school level. And now you're back again at a budget that is opaque, to say the least. I think we need to move to full transparency over there.
Okay, talking about transparency and opaqueness, let's move to probably your favorite state agency, the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Talking about lack of transparency, double books, huge surplus, $833 million surplus after I'm paying more for my Metro card, and they want to spend $481 million building a deck over the rail yards? Excuse me, tell me that I'm not crazy, and they are.
I can't, at this point, I just wondered, am I living in another universe, an alternate universe? It's kind of like, look, we had just gone through a process with them before where, for the first time, we audited them down here on the Transit Authority right after they tried to do, a fair increase, right after they did a negotiated settlement a couple years ago with, with their union, with Transport Workers Union, and turned around and they said they had a massive deficit. I looked at the Transit Authority piece. Alan Hevesy looked at the larger piece. We both compared notes. They had a $600 million surplus. So they lied to us. Now, the one thing on the positive side, and definitely, you know, Peter Calico and Katie Lab, they have created a lot more transparency in their budget, because they couldn't come back and do that again. If they did, I think the public would have stormed the building.
Right.
Now they I think I would have joined you. Now they have a huge surplus, and you're right, the discussion now, and that's a huge surplus after service cuts and after digging deeper into our pockets again.
Thank you.
It is right now for them to do a deck, and what I suggested, you know, was doing a deck or spending $300 or $400 million to do a deck, and made no sense. Go get somebody, do an RFP, let us process a part of that RFP process, a request for proposal, let a developer do that without us putting money into it. If they're going to, if they're in fact have a surplus, what they should do is a couple of things. Number one, you have unfunded pension liabilities, do some of that. Number two, you've got a lot of long-term debt. That's what's helped to drive up the cost of the fare. Use it to work against that, and then save some of that money to work against, because they still have a scheduled fare increase in a couple of years. Use it so we don't have to dig deeper in our pockets again. That makes more sense than let's go build a deck over the Hudson Yards and hope that, you know, that somebody will come along and in fact build on it. I think their history as a real estate agency isn't a great one when you look at 2 Broadway and a number of others. Stay with what you know. Let us not have to dig deeper in our pockets. That's what's wrong about it.
What about Atlantic Rail Yards? Similar type of deal. I mean, from my point of view, I mean, you're looking at it from the Office of the Comptroller. I'm looking at it as a citizen, and I'm saying, wait a minute, this sounds like West Side Jet Stadium 2 here.
Difference. I think that if you look at what the developer has done, I think that the price of the rail yards, and as a matter of fact, they have sat vacant for years and years and years, and there hasn't been any other real plan to be able to do development there. Bruce Ratner and Forest City Ratner's plan on that is to do not just a stadium, but commercial space, 4,500 units of housing.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
But the difference is, and what's happened over there in Brooklyn is, the developers entered into an agreement with the community so that half the units are affordable housing units, so that the jobs that people from the community, as well as African American and Latinos, and women get jobs as far in the construction phase, so that minority businesses get work during this phase. It is something that benefits everybody, which is very different from just the stadium on the Hudson Yards.
Okay, but the rail yards, we're not getting full value. We're not.
I think you're getting, the question becomes, what value? Because right now, no one else had proposed anything over there that's real. And no one else had stepped forward to say, this is what we'd like to do. This, I mean, it is benefit in, I believe now the price is up to $100 million that we'll get for it, decking over those yards. But secondly, it's what also is the other benefit for the community and for Brooklyn and for New York City. And I think there's a larger benefit in that.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes and I've got a half hour's worth of question. Let's do it quick. Snapple. Have you drunk Snapple since the last interview?
No, as I said, it's kind of like I've been Snapple free for probably getting close to 3 years now.
What's the status of the suit was that, in a sense, they won on a technicality, that they were allowed to put the machines in with the faulty process, but the court ruled that the process was faulty, and from now on they had to go through the process. And you're involved in this.
Our suit just wasn't about Snapple in the schools, or Snapple right now is the product of New York City. It was the process, or the lack of process, that they went through. And last but not least, the New York City name. It's not there for the mayor to determine who gets and used the, you know, the official drink of New York City. It should be the people of New York City. It belongs to us. So what happened is, we said you had to go through a process. You should go through an open and transparent and public process. The court agreed with us. On a technicality, they said we filed a little too late, so they allowed Snapple to move forward. But everything else moving forward, the court originally said, got to go through a process. The mayor's people said they won. We said we won. They appealed. They went to the appellate division, where the appellate division upheld the lower court's decision and basically, again, ruled with us. Well, the mayor's people again said they won. We said, well, if you continue to win, why do you keep appealing?
Okay.
And now what happens is they've asked the appellate division for leave to go to the Court of Appeals, because I think they lost unanimously, and that's where we're at right now.
Okay. Last economics before we get to politics. Goldman Sachs. You have a release that says Goldman Sachs was a good deal. Let me differ with you.
Okay.
Goldman Sachs was not leaving the city of New York. They were moving uptown.
Right.
We're spending a couple of $100 million in quote-unquote corporate welfare to bring them downtown. Is that a wise investment of city money?
Okay, that's something that in my office we probably had the strongest internal debate of any issue that's come to us, whether it made sense. First, the use of Liberty bonds, well, that's what it was designed for, that use of Liberty bonds. And then the incentives that were from the state and from the city, did it make sense? I think if you look at Lower Manhattan and particularly in the, in the World Trade Center area, it was important to get a major employer, a major new building constructed down there in that area. Goldman Sachs was it. I think that what you've seen now is, and I've heard from real estate people, all of a sudden people who hadn't signed leases or re-signed their leases now are saying they're going to stay in Lower Manhattan. And other companies are starting to ask, well, maybe we'd like to go to Lower Manhattan too. Or places around, not just in the city, but from outside the city. Well, maybe we're thinking about Lower Manhattan. In the long run, I think it will be, and as I said, it's something I had to wrestle with. I think it's good for Lower Manhattan. It's good to restabilize and help that neighborhood grow. In the long run, I think it's good for New York City. That's why we said yes. Lightning
round, politics, a minute and a half. What has seemed to have been a snooze of a race has certainly awakened. Right now, on Tuesday, you've got 1199. It looks like an endorsement of Freddie.
Right.
Democratic unity on City Hall. Can the Democrats win?
Yes. I think that what has to happen is we have to continue over the next 7 weeks to excite people, to make this a debate about the future of New York City. Then I think you have a chance of winning this.
What's the message?
Oh, I think it's a message of growth, a message of employment, but I think it's to talk about contrasting visions, and I think that's the one thing the mayor hasn't talked about. What's his vision for New York City 5 and 10 years down the road? And I think Freddie Ferrer has to do the same thing and put forward a vision that talks about people in all communities across the city getting employed, people in schools, and really having long-term gain in schools, not a one-year blip as far as reading scores, long-term gain. I think that's the message to talk about the future of New York City, not just where we've come from, where we're going to go.
Okay, what about Billy Thompson? I have to ask the question. The pundits would kill me. 2009, I know the 2005 election hasn't happened. You're clearly one of one or two people who would be the obvious Democratic candidate should Ferrer not win.
That's one of those right now. This is one we're focused on trying to let Freddie Ferrer, and I've put a lot of energy into it. If that does, this is what happens in 2009. Let's see what happens in 2005 first, and then we can have a conversation.
Okay. Hillary, should she pledge to serve a full term?
I don't think so. I think that right now, for New York State, she's been an excellent senator, and then if you can have a senator from New York State be the president of the United States, I think that's great for New York.
Okay. Elliot Spitzer, run unopposed?
Probably not. From what I hear, Tom Suozzi's thinking about it, but Elliot is a strong candidate.
George Pataki, is he hallucinating?
About?
Presidency?
Geez, I don't know who's going to vote for him for president. I don't even know if he can survive Republican primary. I think he's got problems there.
Sir, too little time, too many questions. Thank you.
That's it.
Always a pleasure.
Good
yes, that's it.
Okay.